Here's your host, Alex Garrett.
Ladies and gentlemen, you could have been anywhere in the world tonight, but you're here with us in New York City. Are you ready?
I know I am. Hey, I'm Alex Garrett, your host for this episode and everything Alex Garrett Podcasting. And this podcast specifically focuses on topics that should be trending. And, well, you know what they say, right?
Oh, if the shoe fits, wear it.
Well, that line means so much to me. Find out why next on Alex Garrett Podcasting, where we wear that shoe proudly. Well, yesterday was a pretty, this weekend is always an interesting weekend. It's a weekend of reflection and solemnness, really, to think back on what happened 19 years ago. And yet, I would say there is some good news for the city that we've been longing to hear. And I immediately jumped out to reach out to Zach Williams of City and State New York. He is the Albany bureau chief. Zach, Governor Cuomo making some huge news. I think you can keep us up to speed better than I could. So what exactly is going to go down the next couple of weeks reopening-wise?
Well, the governor, as you mentioned, gave the green light for New York City to resume indoor dining, and this really had been seen as kind of the next obvious step for the ongoing reopening process. As I'm sure you and your listeners remember, it was supposed to be kind of a 4-stage process, but then it kind of ended up this extra de facto 5th stage where we've seen things like indoor dining, maybe movie theaters down the road, and a few other activities come up. And the governor basically said that restaurants can reopen in the 5 boroughs on September 30th by meeting a few conditions. Some of this includes 25% capacity. They have to close down by midnight, and a few other requirements. Patrons have to leave contact information in case the cluster emerges from a restaurant. So, by and large, the restaurant industry has been pretty pleased that they're allowing indoor dining, but has taken issue with some of these requirements, which, if you go down them, it seems like it's going to take the city will have to be pretty lucky if people really abide by all. I think there was 9 requirements. We'll just see how it goes. A big thing with the governor, of course, was whether or not there would be enough enforcement of it. He's on that issue quite a bit. This idea that New York was somehow worse at enforcing social distancing than other areas of the state. Some good reporting hasn't really borne that out very well. But at the very least, from his perspective, he's getting a little bit less of the political heat because these restaurants are going to get to start reopening indoor in the coming weeks.
Well, let's talk about this because it's been a fight for New Yorkers to begin with since March, since Phase 4 too. But I wanted to say, even 9/11 tribute down here by Zuccotti Park, that was a fight to get done. I mean, why are they being so locked downish about everything? Is it because they might feel liable about something? I mean, it seems a little overreach even to cancel 9/11 festivities. Don't you agree?
I think something that I've observed is, early on, the governor, really early on, if we go back to March, and, the governor took a little bit of a slower approach that he later seems to have regretted later on. A lot of reporting came out that, waiting until March 20th, for example, to have the stay-at-home issue really might have let the virus get out of greater control than it really had to be. And since then, it seems like the Cuomo administration has leaned to a much more cautious reopening, especially in New York City, in terms of what's, right now, levels of infection are pretty low in the city. It's been about a month with less than 1% of the reports that's coming back. So far, so good. What I'm really waiting to see is sooner or later there's going to be a big cluster in New York City. The infection rate's going to go up. Not saying it's going to be on the scale like it was back in the spring, but, something's going to happen, kind of this, months-long suspense about whether or not there's ever going to be a second wave of infections will finally end. And, based on the decisions the governor and the mayor have made will live with consequences. Maybe they'll look smart, or maybe they'll just look like they, unduly harmed some of these businesses that could have reopened earlier. Some people have pointed out bowling alleys as an example. It's an activity, you're inside. We know the virus spreads more when you're inside. At the same time, maybe if you close down every other lane, you could still kind of prevent too much contact. A couple weeks in, we haven't heard of any infections from a bowling alley. So maybe with at least looking at it in retrospect, it looks like they could have let bowling alleys open a bit earlier than they really did, which I think was about a month ago.
Well,
so, in terms of 9/11, 9/11 ceremonies, I mean, they did do it downtown.
It was beautiful, too. It was really beautiful, actually.
Yeah, and everyone was there. You saw the governor, you saw, former Vice President Biden, everybody else wearing masks. Back in May, maybe back in April even, I remember when some advocacy groups started having protests. And to some extent, we saw kind of, I don't know, what did we even call them back then? The reopening protesters. They weren't quite as, things didn't get as crazy here as they were in, like, Michigan, if you remember. But,
sure.
People started venturing outside, and we were kind of like, are they going to get infected? Are they not? The first time I went to a protest, I was, like, practically in one of those suits from Outbreak. I had, like, a face shield and, like, my dust mask and, like, gloves and, this like latex thing. I don't really know. I hadn't been, really out in a crowd of hundreds of people, right? Kind of
sure.
felt kind of weird.
Yeah. Yep.
But then we all kind of went out and, I've heard some interesting theories about why there weren't, more outbreaks at, say, like the Black Lives Matter protests or any of these other things. But, whatever the cause was, it turned out not to be so bad. It seems like this 9/11 ceremony was held safely outside. You're a New Yorker, I'm a New Yorker. We always know things tend to start sucking more when we get into October, November. It doesn't matter if there's a pandemic or an election or anything, right? Like, things just start to suck more. So we'll just kind of have to see what happens. But, I think based on, like, the quote-unquote public health experts that I, see and hear and talk to, the governor gets somewhat, maybe a B plus on kind of how he handled things early on, and gets higher marks from a public health perspective, for how he kind of held things on May, June, July, August. Pretty good that we haven't had more infections, right? But,
sure. But it
sure didn't help business.
But I think it's important to say that he did have all these resources here, and yet he did put them back in nursing homes. I think that's such a stain,
yeah.
And it shouldn't go ignored either. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but as he was doing these daily briefings, you really thought everything was great until these news come out that, he made this order to put people in nursing homes. I mean, what were your thoughts on all that? Even as he was trying to backtrack and defend it, what was your mind set as you kept hearing him at these briefings talk about that alone?
Well, as someone that got to, kind of see, the governor up close in the first month or so of the pandemic, being at the briefings and some of his other appearances, it was kind of like 9/11, if you remember. There was kind of a, give him a chance attitude, support the governor, just kind of like back in the day, support the president. And, people weren't waving New York flags exactly, but, there was kind of a brief sense of, trust the governor. And, and that's the only problem with that is, sooner or later, people make mistakes. And then we always have to see what happens, whether they acknowledge them and learn from them and move on. And I think in some ways the governor was very defensive about some of this stuff, especially the nursing homes thing. Maybe the politics of the whole situation might have been different if he like, like Gavin Newsom in California had like just like about the same policy. And they saw infections going up in nursing homes, and they're like, okay, we're going to stop this. And they stopped it, a month or two before New York did. And Cuomo didn't do that. He kind of defended it, and then they had their reports. And, it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out, because it kind of, like a lot of problems in government, a problem about, whether somebody made the right choice in a difficult situation became issues of did they hide information? Did they admit their mistakes? Did they change course at the right time? And there's some real questions about that with the nursing home issue. I think there's maybe 3 or 4 really good or really prominent issues with how the governor's handled it. Did he close down things fast enough? Did he open them too fast or too slow? Whatever your opinions are, right? The nursing home thing, I think hurt him most in terms of kind of knocking him off his pedestal. He was having a pretty good run as a politician in March and April.
He was having such a good run, he couldn't wait to get back at the microphone every day, it seemed like. So that was that. He was just like, hey, Zach, I got to say, you talk about this closing. Did he close too late? Well, why couldn't we as a country and then we as a state also just say, hey, if the NCAA is canceling their tournament in the beginning of March, we have a problem. I feel like that was not conveyed or that was ignored. I mean, that this big announcement of all these tournaments and then the March Madness, and we were still open after that. I think if you close down that weekend, that might have made a big difference.
I sometimes, I obviously write about this in terms of judging the state and the city responses and to some extent the federal one as well. I think everybody could agree that if all the political leaders and March 1st had said, we see it coming, we're going to do it, we're going to stop it. It seems like, obviously the president had some good information at least a month before that things were going to get really bad. And I believe the governor and the mayor also had similar information, maybe not as early because, they don't get intelligence briefings, but we all wish that things could have been closed down earlier, and that didn't happen, and there was a Wall Street Journal piece that came out that kind of went over some of this history, and, you might recall that de Blasio took a lot of heat for not closing down things, and he wanted to do it faster than Cuomo, and Cuomo kept, overruling him. Cuomo, like the president now, is saying, I didn't want to inspire panic. Well, that obviously wasn't getting back to admitting mistakes. The important thing is you admit the mistake now. We all know a few days difference, a week's difference could, save thousands of lives. That's just facts, right?
Right. Hey, Zach, we'll get back to the panicking because I'm amazed how people turn a blind eye to even senators selling their stocks knowing this thing was coming. I mean, you can't make that one up, can you? But what are you working on? Because I'm sure this whole thing has given you some incredible pieces to write that maybe no one else is thinking of or having an angle at.
Well, good for you for reminding me about the whole senators selling their stock. I hope people are listening to that. I think for me, the story of the pandemic has really been the expansion of the governor's power during, he is state government right now. There is state legislature, and they've been doing some stuff, and they've, had their successes and arguable failures in recent months at times. But, the governor at the beginning of March had a low approval rating, a tough budget process, frenemies in the state legislature, and then a big crisis came, and like George W. Bush in 2001, everything turned around. Emergency powers, rule by decree, in Cuomo's case, I mean. So it's been quite amazing to just see, the ups and downs of that. There's been all these, obviously his relationship with Trump has been absolutely nuts at times. It's
and his own mayor. This is the funniest thing. His own mayor and him can't get along. And we're in the middle of a pandemic and they're still acting like they're on the schoolyard. It's like, what the heck, man?
Yeah. It was a funny place that we were in say, April when, President Cuomo was trending and Andrew Cuomo, of all politicians, had become a source of moral strength for the American people. And you're like, wow, how things change. It was just, all these different political leaders reacted to things very differently. I think Cuomo, to on some important points, did so in a way that was informed by expertise and kind of standard and what you would kind of hope a semi-competent political leader would recognize, to just, test, boost testing, that type of stuff, right?
Right.
The president is the president, and we'll just avoid going too deep into that because there's just too much there. And then de Blasio, de Blasio has taken all the heat. The governor made many of the same calls, overruled the mayor at times when they wanted to close public schools, when he wanted to do the stay-at-home order, all those things. And it's de Blasio whose reputation has suffered. I think if you would have told me in May that New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio could lose more public esteem and support, I would have been like, how? He does have he's remained pretty popular in the black community, which keeps him politically relevant. But and then the Black Lives Matter protests.
Yep.
I think if you look at it from just pure politics angle, Cuomo's skill at shifting political responsibility at times for, the police and dealing with police brutality and his whole proposal that they got to figure it out by next month. He didn't face any political liability for all this, whereas the mayor, he has had one of the worst years. Someone's got to write a book about that. It all started when he ran for president. And then he staged a political comeback at sorts when he had Billy Idol do the anti-idling campaign. Remember that?
I do. Yep, I remember that.
Yeah, that was the end of de Blasio Camelot.
Well, yeah. Hey,
so it's been a fascinating couple months.
It's interesting you say the turnaround because let's just face it, Zach. Let's be real here. What we were going to see was bail reform really wreck the city, so they say, and really just be the downfall of Cuomo. Yet this sort of came in, and he looked like a hero. It's amazing how a month changes everything, as you say.
Well, and something to note, because it's been so long since we've talked, is, he's the one that strong-armed the legislature to a good extent and got it through the budget. That budget was completely dominated by what he wanted. Increase his power even more. And the funny thing is, all these things we've talked about, since the beginning of the year, we've had the impeachment, we almost went to war with Iran, and then the pandemic, and then, all the protests and all that, and the presidential election, and yet we're still talking about the same core issue by the end of it all, which is criminal justice reform and the economy. And obviously the pandemic's, a hot item too, but it's pretty funny just how criminal justice reforms were the big issue at the beginning of the year, and they're still arguably the biggest, one of the biggest, along with the pandemic issue going into the election.
Well, I've got to pull the soundbite where de Blasio says, "We gave these people mercy to let them out of the prisons. Why would they do this? Are you kidding me, Mayor?" It was a wild scene, certainly when they started to release prisoners out of during the COVID crisis out of concern. But as you said, but so 2020 is still not over yet. I think that's the craziest part of all this. 2020 is still not over, but are you seeing any optimism from where you sit? Because I do. I think these businesses that have continued to stay strong and stay reopened, deserve a lot of credit. And unfortunately, it's de Blasio and Cuomo that like to say, well, look at us, we reopened. But look at the small business that took time to get themselves prepared and get themselves fixed and stay alive during this. That's admirable too. But so do you have any positive outlook here for the rest of 20?
Well, nothing gets decided politically until the presidential election is decided. In terms of the state budget, everything depends on federal aid. It sure looks like that's not going to happen unless Joe Biden is elected president. So that's one way things would go. Joe Biden wins. The Democrats take the Senate or don't take the Senate. They'll probably expand their control in New York State. And there'll be more federal aid, and and we'll see how everything else goes. But that's so much at the city and the state level depends on the budget, and we just don't know. People want to raise taxes right now, but until there's some clarity on
what is that about? Because I just heard about that. He wants to now raise taxes amidst all of this.
Well, Cuomo is so we got our three little kingdoms in the legislature, right? The Assembly, they're the most liberal, arguably. They want to raise taxes the most. The state Senate now is also joining them in that. And then Cuomo, he's trying to, for political reasons, I'm sure, hold the line as the anti-tax guy, which is, he's tried to do for years. But at the same time, he's still pushing for the federal aid because who doesn't want free money from Washington, right? And, if they can get it, that makes everything else easier.
Right. No.
So,
and by the way,
he's trying to show that he's holding the line on taxes. And if the Democrats in the legislature want to push him so hard, then he'll just say, well, they pushed me against the wall. I had to do it. It's their, you see where I'm going. It's like he's not going to be the main advocate for raising taxes. Why would he want to do that? Let the lawmakers take the heat.
Unbelievable. And by the way, speaking of unions and all that other stuff, the schools now, we see 2 positive cases in Brooklyn. I'm amazed that didn't really get reported widely. I thought it would get more play, but if we see more, is there a chance Cuomo closes that again?
Well, they've laid a benchmark. I think it's 5% positive for the school or 100 total cases. And if that happens, the school closes for 2 weeks, and the whole class, the teachers quarantine. And I think if you have 2 positive cases in a single class, the whole class has to quarantine. Don't quote me on that, but I think that's a general guideline. They're actually not doing that for indoor dining. That's more of we'll kind of take a look and incorporate all sorts of viewpoints thing. So it's kind of interesting the difference between the two. There's a really hard line on the public schools, but not with indoor dining. But anyways, public schools will be an interesting one because, kind of like with universities, you're going to probably get big numbers quick. We've seen all sorts of cases at public universities, but at the same time, public university, because you got lots of people congregating, and children and younger people tend to be more asymptomatic, which means they're going to spread it more, right? Because they don't know they have it necessarily. But at the same time, at universities, everyone's kind of living together away from all the kind of the older people, except for the faculty and staff, right? Like they're not near their families, whereas I would guess that someone in high school or elementary school would be more inclined to be around older folks, their parents, more vulnerable people, right? So it would be really interesting to see, and this is purely hypothetical, but, you get similar levels of infection as in universities, but it has an arguably outsized effect on parents, grandparents, people that the children come in contact with. But, will they close it down? I bet it's going to be a lot of school by school before we talk about like system-wide or statewide, because there's just, if you really think about it, there's just so much more awareness and capacity than, in March to control these type of things, right?
Right. Hey, well, yeah, I think that's the other reason why I'm a little more optimistic if a second wave happens. We've kind of been there. We kind of know what to do and maybe even avoid the risk this time. So I'm confident we can pull through that should there be another wave. Hey, Zach, I got to ask you this. Are you going to Cuomo's steak dinner for the billionaires that he wants to come back? I got to ask you, did you get an invite for that one?
No invitation yet, but we know how long the mail takes nowadays.
Yeah, yep. Well, maybe it'll be sped up at the election. We'll have to see about that. And then this mask violation. I talk about this in text. I mean, is it too late for that? What? Why now?
Ooh, that's a really interesting one. We've seen, in terms of social distancing, we've seen, this whole kind of seesaw, right, between lots of enforcement and none at all, mask shaming, all that. I think the fact of the matter is we have had pretty good success in terms of getting people generally to wear masks in New York City, at least, where I live. I'm in Hudson River Park right now talking to you, and most people have masks on. I took mine off. I'm a little bit further from people and talking to you, but generally it's pretty good. You know, the $50 that they announced with MTA is interesting because I believe that if police wanted to enforce mask wearing at, say, a park or a beach or somewhere else, they could slam you with like $1,000 fine, which, you know, I would say has more of a deterrent effect, right? Like if I heard my friends say they had to pay $1,000 because they didn't wear their mask for a couple of minutes, like I'm probably going to wear my mask, right?
Right.
$50 fine, it's kind of like leaving your feet on the seats, like, you know, which happened to me once. Got a ticket because I put my feet on, you know, the bench, and you're just kind of like, you know.
But I can't get over after what we've seen, they're worried about that. After all the looting and all the breaking down and boarding up of businesses, they're worried about this. They seem to not be concerned about the other more violent lawlessness.
You bring up another interesting thing about how, how I think the political left kind of squandered an opportunity to some extent to get more buy-in from the political right. You know, we saw Republicans, for Cuomo example, huge. At one point, the trust in Cuomo in New York versus Trump was much higher among Republicans, which was, a mind-blowing statistic, right? Like, who would have imagined? But the protests, while there weren't outbreaks and stuff, I think it did kind of squander some of the moral capital, if you will, that the political left had because, and at the same time, it wasn't just because they were having protests, right? Because the political right had been having protests for weeks. It was that they had just weeks before been kind of like, pandemic shaming. And I'm not talking about all the anti-lockdown protests because some of them were kind of crazy, like in Michigan and stuff. But, a lot of the ones you saw like in Albany were like people driving around the Capitol in cars or like standing 10 feet apart, like, doing it pretty well. And it was small groups anyways. And there was a lot of criticism, like, look at these people, they're a bunch of COVIDiots and so on. And then you had all these Black Lives Matter protests, and, that just rubs a lot of people wrong. When you have de Blasio and Cuomo saying, oh, these people, or just people generally in the political left, I think much more than those two people specifically, saying like, oh, this is great. When just a few weeks before, in retrospect, I bet they would have been more tolerant of some of those early protests that were coming from the political right, even if they didn't necessarily agree with them. It's interesting to imagine how things could have been a little bit differently because, we were really talking about in April, like kind of this reconceiving government and educate, there was kind of a real excitement in some extent that like things were going to be rebuilt and that at least, I'm not going to say the whole country, but maybe 60% were really maybe invested in, kind of redefining things from top to bottom. But, then everybody kind of went back to normal and everything became polarized again, right?
I feel like, as you say, with criminal justice, the other theme is polarization wins the day no matter what. And sorry for being cynical here, but I really thought there was going to be a protest outside the 9/11 memorial today. That's how divided I fear we've become, is that even 9/11 could be protested. It's crazy to think about, but that's the reality we're in right now.
Oh, geez. Well, luckily there wasn't, as far as I know, there weren't any invitation problems. We all know how things could have been all sorts of crazy if, let's say if Trump had said he wanted to come to Ground Zero today. A lot of people would be like, well, he's the president, he should go, right? That's what presidents do. They go to memorials and, but then, luckily none of that happened. So things stayed pretty chill. As far as I know, on 9/11, nobody, I haven't heard anybody say some ridiculous thing one way or another, right? So maybe there is still something holy in American society after all.
On that note, thank you for that little anecdote that there's something holy still in America. I mean, I'm looking every day. I literally, when I got back to the city, I couldn't help but wander the streets to try and find some normalcy.
There is hope, man. There's hope.
Yes, sir. Hey, Zach, where can people find you? Where can they find your writing at City and State New York?
Well, they Twitter at Zach Reports. That's Zach with an H, and they can read my work and the great work of my colleagues at city and state NY, like NewYork.com.
All right, Zach. Well, thanks so much, and we'll have you back for sure. And I'm Alex Garrett. Have a blessed rest of your solemn weekend. We'll talk to you soon.